I love that spot just because it's like a stone's throw away from Laguna Beach and Newport Beach and Huntington Beach and all those amazing surf spots and whatnot. So yeah, love spending time down there on the OC as it is. But I do have a copy of your new book, Attention Span. I've actually referenced your work in several HBR articles that I wrote on better ways of work. And my last book, Time Rich, I referenced your study on the 23-minute cognitive switching penalty as well, which I found really fascinating, particularly when you look at the way people work today. So keen to dive in, keen to unpack some lessons from the book and, hopefully impart some wisdom for our listeners today. Okay. But this is your first book. How did you? Well, maybe not. Okay.
Sort of. So I have an academic book, and I'm an academic, and I've written like 200 articles. So writing a book it's sort of a compilation of my research over the past 20 plus years. So it is my first trade book. You can say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your first trade book, and you weren't always in the space of academia. I mean, what was this sort of serendipitous hop, skip, and jump into this space of studying attention? What did that look like?
Yeah. So I started out studying art, and I never thought I would do anything except be an artist. And, it was a very immersive kind of experience. I really enjoyed it. But then the reality of making a living hit me. And so, I was able to make a living. I worked, it was a very brief career in art, I will say that. And I realized that there were a lot of other things I could do where it would be a lot easier to make a living. And I was good in math and science. And I thought, I could be just as creative in math and science as I could be in art. So I made the switch. So I have done other things. And I will claim that having studied art really helped me in science. And I would even make the claim that I think everyone should study some form of art, because it really teaches people how to be creative. And that's such an important skill to be able to have. It doesn't come naturally for a lot of people, but people can learn how to become creative. And I think it's so important.
Absolutely. I think David Epstein wrote about this in his book Range, where he kind of went against Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule and said, there are examples of high performers such as Roger Federer, who up until the age of about 15 tried a lot of different sports, and he was able to connect dots between these different disciplines to be better at tennis. And, not necessarily double clicking on art there, but just trying different things and learning from different disciplines and bringing these unique perspectives into a field where perhaps other people in that field don't have that background, and that can give you a bit of an edge and a different way of seeing the world.
Yes, but I will say, after art, I did spend those 10,000 plus hours, in my specialty. So I did start out in a different field, but it did take me a fair number of hours to become proficient and a specialist in what I do.
And I totally resonate with the whole wanting to do art, but not necessarily being able to make a living doing it. So I've got nice short hair, short back and sides now, but growing up, I had hair down to my waist. I wanted to play in a heavy metal band, believe it or not, Gloria, but that was never going to pay the bills. So I went into different fields, but I'm sure I took some of that sort of anti-authoritarian streak that characterizes a lot of heavy music and brought it into my work. And here I am wearing a South by Southwest top with a bit of an AC/DC emblem. So that kind of, maybe that's a harking back to my earlier days, but really excited to talk to you today about your new book. I was fortunate enough to have Scott Belsky on this show couple of years ago now. So if you're not familiar with him, he's the founder of a company called Behance, basically a creative marketplace that was sold to Adobe for several $100 million. And one thing he said during that conversation struck me, and it stuck with me to this day. And it's that today, attention is the true scarce resource. It's not money, it's not these other things, it's attention. And I was in the gym this morning before this conversation. I saw a couple of kids in there, must have been Gen Z, about 25 years old, staring at their phones for a good 10 minutes in between sets. And not because they want to, but I imagine they've been sucked into this world where they feel constantly pulled back. And when we look at some of the statistics, people are spending 4 to 5 hours a day staring at their phones. Something you pointed to in your book, they're switching screens every 40 seconds while they're at their desks. And they're finding it hard to get into these sort of deep focus states. But before we get into that, I'd love for you to just unpack at a high level what the anatomy of attention looks like.
So, we tend to think of attention as being in one central place in the brain, but attention actually works like networks. So in the same way that the financial system is a series of different networks, there's no single entity that we can point to and say, this is the financial system. There are banks, credit unions, insurance companies, and so on. And it's the same with attention. So you have this network of vigilance, which is, this is in charge of, having us use sustained attention. Then there is another network which is involved in selecting what it is you want to look at or focus on. So, when that notification flashes on your screen, that network comes into play because it's telling your attentional system, it's telling your mind, oh, let's focus on this thing with flashing, blinking lights. And then there's a third system, which is called executive control. And you can think of this as, like in sports, running interference in American football, where you're trying to, weed out all kinds of peripheral information so we can keep the individual's mind focused on the task at hand.
And would you say that with that third piece there on executive control, is that something that people perhaps have different, predispositions towards, like how much executive control they actually have?
Sure. Yeah. There are, of course, individual differences in the way that we use attention and pay attention. Some people are born lucky with a personality trait for good self-regulation, but a lot of people aren't. And if you're not born with such a trait, don't fret, because you can build that up. You can learn how to develop a skill for good self-regulation. It's unfortunate that not all of us were born with good self-regulation skills, because some people, and I've talked to so many people over the years in doing research, they have absolutely no trouble staying focused, staying on track. But there's also quite a large number of people that, really seek help in doing that.
Absolutely. And would you say that coming across different sort of segments of people, some are more focused than others, have you noticed any patterns between sort of generations, particularly, for example, Gen Z, who have been raised basically from the cradle with a phone in their hands in some cases, something that I'm definitely not an advocate of, but it is the case. Would you say that they have a harder time focusing than, say, Gen Xers who didn't get phones until they were in their 30s?
Yeah, so I think that behavior is kind of evening out. And I still think that individual differences play a pretty big role, even a bigger role than generational differences. Having said that, we know that young people spend more time on social media. And so there's, more chances for distraction. We also know that there's more peer pressure for young people to use social media. So again, there's, more opportunity for them to to use the social media. You know, we've done studies looking at college age students, and we find, you know, they really check social media a lot. They switch their screens a lot. But when we've looked at age differences in a workplace, in the knowledge workplace, we really don't find differences between someone who's just out of their undergraduate in their early 20s and someone who's older.
Okay, so you mentioned there's social media that younger college students will check it quite often and switch screens quite a lot. What are some of those forces of distraction, as you put it in your book, that people are wrestling with today?
Oh, well, first of all, keep in mind that we live in a socio-technical world. And what that means is we don't use technology in a vacuum. There's all kinds of underlying forces that influence our attention. In fact, there's a common narrative to blame our distraction solely on notifications and algorithmic feeds, and that's absolutely a part of it, right? But that's not the full story. There's so many other things going on. For example, as I write about in the book, the very design of the internet itself distracts us, and we may not think about it, but the origins of the web can be traced back to an idea called the memics. And if anyone is in the tech field, you're familiar with the name Vannevar Bush. He's an engineer. He used to be the head of the U.S. Office of Scientific Information. And right after World War II, he was looking for a way to better organize information. So he was leading this agency of 6,000 people. And he figured, you know, at the time, it was the Dewey Decimal System. And that's pretty hard to find information. If you've ever tried to use that system in a library, you have to look up a number, even if you're using information online. It organizes information by a hierarchy. And Vannevar Bush said, no, that's not the way people think. Humans think in terms of associations. And so he came up with this idea called the memics, which organized information based on how the different documents or media were associated with each other. The memics was never built, but then, you know, fast forward, many people built on that idea and the web came about. And the web mimics the way that human memory is structured in terms of a semantic network, because we think in terms of associations. So when we go on a Wikipedia page or when we're surfing the internet, there's so many entry points into our mind's network when we're looking at a Wikipedia page. And we see these links, they map onto associations that we've made, or they create new associations. And before you know it, we're just off on this joyride through the internet. So that's an example of how there's a different kind of force that affects our attention.
Yeah, and I guess that's why, as you put it, people can find themselves maybe reaching for their phone for a couple of minutes, but before they know it, 30 minutes have gone by, they've gone deep down the rabbit hole, and then they absolutely despise themselves for having done it afterwards and feel like crap. And I think that's, you know, we see that when perhaps we're sitting down, we're watching a film, and we're like, oh, I wonder what that actor's up to today. And we reach for our phone, and then we'll see what they're working on. Oh, they released a film recently. Let me check that film out. I didn't go to the cinemas. It went straight to Netflix. Oh, how did it do? Let's check Rotten Tomatoes for the reviews. Oh my God, I can't believe what this critic said about this. Let's check out this critic's other reviews to see if they're constantly nasty. And it never ends. It never ends. But there are, I suppose, some technological things we can do there. For example, with YouTube, obviously that's built upon a similar sort of thing where you can be clicking forever. Like I've installed a browser plugin for YouTube where you just don't see any recommended videos on the side of the screen based on what you're already watching. Now, that helps us maybe get 10% of the way there, but there are so many internal triggers as well. For example, if I'm feeling a little bit lonely, it's not the notification that's going to make me open my phone and check out Instagram or Facebook. It's that internal sort of desire to connect with other people.
Sure, absolutely. And, we are social creatures, and we have these very basic human social natures. We seek social rewards, and social media, it provides us with that. Email does too. Now, email actually works a slightly different way. There's this notion of social capital. Mm-hmm. And social capital means that when we interact with other people, we trade in resources, and that's social capital. So if you do a favor for me, I'm Steve, I'm going to repay that favor, right? I'm going to remember it and do it again. And the same kind of social capital idea applies when we have our inboxes. So I'm going to be checking my email because there might be some email that comes along, which is going to be a benefit to me, right? And so I'm going to be watching for that, and I'm going to be answering it. And if it's from someone who I know or someone with who I might have a future opportunity to have some kind of, interaction with, I'm going to answer that email because I'm hoping that something will come from it, and I'm hoping they'll do the same for me, that they will answer my emails. So it keeps us glued to email. There's another aspect of it is identity, right? So we care so much about our identities, and in real life, right, we have a certain kind of identity that we want to convey to people, and it's based on the what we wear, the things we say, who we decide to interact with, the organizations we belong to. But we can create an online identity that can be very different, right? We have a lot of power in how we portray ourselves online. This can distract us really quite a bit. And, some people who put a lot of importance into their online identity can spend a lot of time, right, on social media, just nurturing that identity, maintaining it. So there are so many aspects of our social natures that also are involved in detracting us.
Yeah.
From work.
Sorry, Gloria. I think that a couple of great points there on identity and social capital. And I think Tristan Harris referred to this in his documentary, The Social Dilemma, where he basically said people are walking around with slot machines in their pockets, and they feel this urge to either check email all day long because there may be some email of benefit there. And similarly, when it comes to identity, checking Instagram all day long because they may have gotten some new comments, some new likes, and that reinforces their identity and sense of self-worth to some degree. But I think just on email, given we have so many corporate executives and entrepreneurs in our audience, you can still derive the same amount of social capital without checking it on average every 12 minutes, which is one of the studies I came across, as opposed to, say, 2 or 3 times a day.
Yeah, actually, we found through computer logging methods that people check email on average 77 times a day.
Yeah.
So that's quite a bit. No, absolutely. We don't have to check it that often, but we've tested batching email. Batching email means that when an organization sends out email a few times a day, maybe in the morning, maybe after lunch, maybe at the end of the day. But unfortunately, we find that it doesn't have an effect on self-assessed productivity or on reducing stress. And we measured stress using heart rate monitors so we could get objective measures. Productivity is self-assessed because in knowledge work, there's no clear way to measure productivity. So we have devised a measure to ask people. There's like 6 different dimensions that we ask. But what does affect productivity and stress is email volume. And the amount of time, the duration of time that a person spends on email. So if you want to cut down stress, if you want to assess yourself as being more productive, then it's important to simply spend less time on email. And of course, checking and time on email is correlated. But even if it's batched, people end up spending a lot of time on it.
Yeah. With you mentioned there that even if people batch their checking of email, they're still quite stressed. Is there a possibility that the types of people in that sample perhaps were somewhat more neurotic and they kind of get stressed generally? Because like I'm the type of person that batches my email. When I'm not checking it, I'm good. Like I don't care. I'll check it when I get to it. But I do have friends and people that I've worked with in the past who feel like, oh my God, they go away on holiday for 2 days and they don't check the email and they're so anxious the whole time about emails piling up. Whereas I'm like, I'll get it when I get to it. Is there something to be said about just the different personality types there?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Steve. So neuroticism is a personality trait, and it's part of what's called the Big Five measure of personality, which people in the audience may be familiar with, but it's the most commonly used personality measure. There's 5 measures. There's openness to new experience, conscientiousness, whether you're an extrovert or introvert, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And neuroticism is also called emotional instability. And when people are neurotic, they have a tendency to replay events over and over in their minds. Like, oh, I just had that conversation with my colleague. Could I have said it in a different way? Could it have unfolded in a different way? Neurotics just keep replaying these kinds of events. And that takes up a lot of our attentional resources when we replay these events. And there's less attentional resources to actually spend doing our work. And so the result is, yes, when people have batched email and neurotics see this huge batch of emails that they have to deal with, makes them even more stressed and more nervous. And another way that neuroticism affects our attention is that people have shorter attention spans when they're neurotic. And the reason, as I mentioned, is because we have a limited capacity for attentional resources. And if you're replaying events in your mind and you're worrying, that uses up our attentional resources. And there's less resources to actually devote to the task at hand that's in front of us.
And I guess that limited pool of attentional resources points to why someone might be quite disciplined in maybe not looking at their phone, getting work done perhaps for the first couple of hours of the day. But as the day goes on, the afternoon, the evening, they might find themselves, doom scrolling on Twitter or something because they've kind of just used up all of their attentional resources and they've got no sort of discipline or willpower left.
That's right. So, we start the day with a certain amount of attentional resources. If you've had a really good night's sleep, then you start your day with a full tank of resources. And, it's easier for you to pay attention. But we get drained over the course of the day. And we get drained by actually, and this is contrary to what a lot of people may think, but when you use extended periods of sustained attention, it can drain us. And we can't do that in the same way that we can't lift weights all day without getting exhausted, right? So it's very important to step back and take a break. But we also get drained when we switch our attention. And so, we found that people switch their attention on average about every 47 seconds. If you look at the median is 40 seconds, which is close to the average. But it's basically saying that, half the observations we found, people spend 40 seconds or less time on any screen. So, people's days are characterized generally by this kind of switching. It's what I call kinetic attention, dynamic attention.
Yeah.
And that drains our resources. And so it becomes harder and harder over the day to pay attention. And, you know, we've all had that experience where you just start feeling really tired and exhausted. It's hard to pay attention. You start reading the same text over and over in your mind. It's hard to come up with ideas. If you're writing, it's hard to think of what to write. If you're trying to answer an email, sometimes a thought just doesn't come to you. So those are, you know, the consequences of having our limited attentional resources being drained.
Absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things there that I wanted to deep dive on, and they kind of intertwined, which is the value of rest and what the nature of focused attention is in the workplace. But with rest, I mean, I see it all the time. I've seen it going back 20 years to the start of my career, people not taking a break, people eating lunch at their desks as if that's going to make them more productive. I mean, what can you tell us about the value of, say, stepping away from your desk for 15 or 20 minutes in terms of the impact that has on our attentional resources and ability to focus?
Oh, it's so important. I like to use the metaphor of having your own personal tank of attentional resources. And there's things we do that drain our resources, like I mentioned, you know, switching our attention, or even periods of very long sustained hard focus. But there's things we can do to replenish our resources. And, you know, of course, we all know when you take a nice vacation and you relax, you come back and you just feel so refreshed, right? Or having a really good night's sleep, good quality sleep, you can start your day with this full tank of attentional resources. But during the day, it's also really important to think in terms of this tank of resources that ebb and flow. And it's so important to be able to really pull away for a significant amount of time. And there is this expression that the Japanese use, which is called yohaku no bi, which is the beauty of empty space. And this actually refers to the beauty that you would see in, say, a Japanese garden. When you look at the space surrounding the rocks, it's really quite beautiful, and it sets the rocks off. And when I started out as an artist, you know, I was trained to not just look at the figure, but to understand the space around the figure, because that space is really important, and it helps the figure to really shine. And so I think of this kind of empty space in the same way during the day, because it's important to make us shine when we're doing work, right? So that we need to replenish. And there's a lot of things you can do in this kind of empty space. You can contemplate, just, you know, pull away and contemplate, just, you know, let your mind go. You can meditate. You can go outside and take a walk in nature. And we know that a 20-minute walk in nature can replenish people significantly, makes them less stressed. In research that we've done, we find that people's divergent thinking improves. That means brainstorming after a 20-minute walk, which is pretty amazing. Or, you know, if you can't go outside, it's okay to move around inside, you know, exercise, move around. And sometimes just a short, very short respite of doing what's called rote activity can help your mind take a break. And rote activity is doing something that's engaging, that calms you, that makes you happy, and, you know, allows you to replenish. And, you know, I've talked with a lot of people about what their favorite rote activities are. For me, I have this anagram game that I play. It's just really easy, but it kind of lets my mind take a break. People talk about, one person talked about there's a ball that he throws on a screen that just kind of helps him relax. Some people knit, whatever it is that's relaxing, engaging, and and provides solace for you.
Yeah, and it could be Candy Crush Saga or whatnot, but for 5 minutes or so. And I think on walking as well, getting outside, I did read, I've come across numerous studies that say it increases like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, in the brain, or releases norepinephrine, so a bit more adrenaline, so that when you get back to your desk, you're a lot more focused, as opposed to spending countless hours at your desk without moving, and you get into kind of like a dreamlike trance after a while, and you're not even, your body's there, but your mind really isn't after some point.
That's right.
To tie in some of the stuff you're talking about 47 seconds between switching screens, referring to the study you published years ago on focusing on something, being interrupted, and then it can take you up to about 23 odd minutes to get back into that focused state. That obviously doesn't bode too well for attention or knowledge workers today in terms of the amount of time they can spend in that sort of focused state. But you have identified in your book different attentional states like light engagement, focused attention, for example, and you've differentiated focused attention from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's flow. Can you please just elaborate on how these two states are different?
Yeah, so flow it's really the optimal state of attention. And this was identified by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And he found that when people...
You pronounced it much better than me.
when people are in a flow state, they're so immersed in something that time just doesn't matter, right? They're just not thinking of time. It's the deepest form of engagement. It's also, they're doing an activity where there's an optimal amount of challenge and it's using their skill. And that's really important. So if you're watching Netflix, you're not in a flow state. You're engaged. You're maybe deeply engaged in some film, but you're not challenged. You're not using a skill that you have. When I was an artist, I used to get into flow regularly. It was the nature of the work, and I knew that if I was in my studio, this was when I was in art school, hours would go by, and then all of a sudden I realized it's like, the middle of the night, or it's getting your early morning, and where did all this time go? I was so immersed in what I was doing. I study knowledge work, and the nature of the work is very different. And we find that people don't often get into a flow state in knowledge work. And it's the nature of the work because it involves more of an analytical kind of a mindset. It doesn't mean that it's less rewarding. It's just as rewarding. Can be just as exciting, right? But it's not necessarily a state where time doesn't matter. I've talked to people and they'll say sometimes if they're in a group brainstorming session, they might get into a flow kind of state. Someone who does complex coding can get into a flow state. And again, that's involving challenge and skill. Someone who plays a computer game, right, where they really have to use skill can get into flow. But, most of the time, for knowledge work, the vast majority of time when you're in focus, it's not realistic to expect that you will enter a flow state. You can think of focus as a precursor to getting into flow.
Okay. Just to double click on that, because we say that the nature of knowledge work isn't conducive to flow. And I understand there are tasks that, I think with flow, it's 4% beyond your capabilities. That is kind of where you get into flow. So it's 4% more challenging than what you're capable of. And you have to stretch to get into it. And not all knowledge work will require people to stretch, like responding to an email may not require that. But would there also be something to say about not necessarily the nature of knowledge work, but the nature of how knowledge work gets done in many organizations today, where there is this over-reliance on consensus seeking, checking email all day, attending Zoom meetings, opening up Slack, to the point where even if our work was, say, writing reports, which predisposed to getting into flow. We just don't have the opportunity to get into it because we're switching screens every 47 seconds. We're being pulled into meetings. We're checking email, and the nature of that work perhaps also needs to change.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you that the daily practice that people have in knowledge work is not going to set the stage to get them into flow. And there are things that organizations can do. Working collaboratively, people can get into flow, right? And so, scheduling times to be able to generate ideas, brainstorm ideas with other people can get into flow, as opposed to just, meetings that have very strict protocols, people giving updates. That's not necessarily going to get people into flow.
Yeah.
But if there are ways to design work to promote flow, that's really a really positive thing to do. In my work, I do a lot of writing, and I really don't get into flow when I write. I am deeply focused. And why don't I get into flow? Because I have to use this kind of analytical thinking. I look for words. I'm always looking for the right words to formulate something. An idea might come into my head, but then I have to figure out how to articulate that idea. And that involves more analytical kind of thinking.
Okay. And you say, like, building upon that in terms of getting into a deep focused or the focused attention space, that something knowledge workers today should try to do, given the nature of how work gets done today in most organizations, is rather than try to get into flow, you say that they should learn to better manage their rhythm of attention. Yes. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So we find that, first of all, there are different types of attention. And then there are rhythms in our focused attention. So let me talk a little bit about the different types of attention. When I first started studying attention, I realized that there's different ways that you can be engaged in something. So you can be very deeply engaged and challenged in what you're doing. So when I write, right, I'm engaged, but I'm also challenged. As I talked about, I have to think about the right way to formulate an idea, and I'm, searching for different words. But you can also be engaged and not at all challenged. And that's when I play my panagram game, or, if I'm reading something on the web, right, it's not challenging at all. It's something easy, but I'm very engaged. We find that people are the happiest when they're doing this kind of what we call rote activity, easy but engaging work. Why? Because it's not challenging. It doesn't involve stress.
Sorry, Gloria, when you say happiest, how do you define happiness in that sort of context?
Yeah, so we did a study where we gave people what's called Russell's Circumplex model of mood. And it asks people to rate their mood at the time that this probe is sent along different dimensions. And it's one dimension is how aroused do you feel? And then the other dimension is called valence, which is your emotion positive or negative? And both of these have a continuum. Arousal is a continuum, valence is a continuum. So if you're really pumped up, ready to go, you're really excited, and you feel positive, that's a state of happiness. And just, the contrary, if you have no energy, you're not aroused, and your feeling is negative, then you're feeling blue. That's the label that's given, sadness or feeling blue. So people received probes throughout the day. And at the time, the probes would be on their phone or on their computer screens. The time they received the probes, they had to report their mood. They had to click on this screen that best represented the place they were at at that moment. And, we trained people so that they were able to click really fast to report their mood. So that's how we came up with this.
Interesting.
This notion of.
So I guess that's a kind of like you said, it's a continuum, right? So maybe, I guess there's something to be said there. Then if I spend, say, 5 or 10 minutes on a activity like playing some video game, I might feel happy. But perhaps if I spend too long playing that game, like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, then I might start to feel kind of sick on the inside.
You might feel regret, right? You might feel regret that you've just spent too much time doing that. So, and to the point you made earlier about, going on Candy Crush for a few minutes, it's really important to be strategic. If you're using something as a rote activity to help calm yourself, it's really important to be strategic so that you don't overdo it and don't get stuck in a rabbit hole. So whatever it takes to do that, set a timer or do this 5 minutes before you have a meeting so you can kind of help clear your mind. Let's say you just came out of a really tough meeting and just you don't have time to go outside and take your nice walk in nature. Well, you can do something else to just kind of clear your head. But be strategic so you don't get stuck for a long period of time.
Yeah. Okay, so you were going into the different intentional states and how we can get better at managing our rhythm.
Yes. Okay. So let me first quickly talk about 2 other kinds of attention. So if you're not engaged and not challenged, that's boredom. It's a state of boredom. And if you're challenged but not engaged, we label this a state of frustration. So, for example, if I have a tech problem, I can get very frustrated. I don't know how to solve it, and I'm kind of thrashing around, but I'm just not engaged. I just don't want to do it, but I have to. Yeah. So we find that with focused attention, the attention where you're challenged and engaged, we find that it ebbs and flows over the day, and that people tend to have 2 peaks. And there's one peak on average that occurs mid to late morning. So say about 11 a.m. And then there's another peak that occurs mid-afternoon, 2 to 3 p.m. Now, there are individual differences, and it depends on your chronotype. If you're an early type, you're someone who likes to wake up really early and get going, your peak is going to be much earlier in the day. If you're a late type, someone who likes to sleep till 10 a.m. or noon, then of course your peak attention will be later. But these times of focus, they ebb and flow. So we have times where we're at our peak, where we can really perform, top notch. But there's other times when we're in a trough, right? And that's not the time you want to do your most creative work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting on the chronotypes as well that you highlighted there. Like, I remember reading that night owls sometimes do their best work 12 hours after waking up. And I think you pointed to some examples in your book of people who get stuff done at like 2 a.m, because that's when they just come alive.
Yeah, there is actually a writer whose best performance is like in the middle of the night. And, because that's the rhythm that works for this particular writer. But, I would say it's important to understand your own personal rhythm of attention and to design your day so that you put in time for the most important work that you need to do at those times when you're at your peak focus. And for goodness sake, don't do email during those peak focus times, and don't keep switching your attention, because we have these precious resources. And think about that tank, and think about, you don't want to have leaks in your tank. And every time we're switching our attention, multitasking, our tank of resources is leaking. Yeah. And we need to preserve these.
Yeah, and I think something people need to perhaps do there is, like, to your point of designing your day, just blocking out time in your day where you can, if you have the agency to, in the company you work for. If you work for yourself, great. If you work for someone else, perhaps you can influence decision makers to enforce something like this. But if it means blocking out, say, 10 a.m. till 11:30 or 2 p.m. till 3:30, so that you can do focused work and not be pulled into meetings and all these other stuff. You're designing your day to get the best out of yourself. And, James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits, BJ Fogg, who wrote Tiny Habits, he's a professor at Stanford, also allude to this thing where it's about designing an environment where you don't have to use your attentional resources and your willpower to get the best out of yourself. Like, if I don't want to eat that bag of Doritos in the cupboard because I'm on a diet, well, it's going to be much easier if that bag of Doritos isn't there. So I design my environment in the way that is going to get the behaviors I desire out of myself.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's the current thinking of designing your environments. And the way that it can apply to not being distracted is that, when we have an urge to check email or to check social media, to just not change the screen. Just stay on that screen. And whatever it takes to get rid of that urge, step up, walk away, come back, but don't switch that screen, because once you go to that site, it's going to be doubly, triply hard to get back. So, people we have agency over changing our behavior. We have much less agency over controlling our urges. Right? Someone who's a smoker who wants to stop, they can do things, changing their environment to control their behaviors, but it's really hard for them to stop that urge that's inside of them for that cigarette.
Absolutely. And you touched on agency there, and it's something you unpacked in the book as well, in terms of the different building blocks, I suppose, if you will, of agency. Can you just double click on that quickly for our audience? Because I think it's important in terms of just shining a light on how much agency people do have and how they can actually get more agency into their workday.
Yeah. So one of the first things we can do is to learn how to be more intentional in our behaviors. There's so many things we do that are automatic. So, reaching for our phone, it's an automatic response. And to be intentional means to make these unconscious responses more conscious, to bring them to our conscious awareness. And when we can do that, we can act on them and we can change. And how can we bring them to our conscious awareness? So I can do it by probing myself. So I've learned to recognize when I have these urges that, I have an urge to check email, an urge to check social media, and I pause and I ask myself, do I really need to do that right now? And chances are no. Or I'll ask myself, why do I have that urge? It's usually because what I'm doing is boring, or I just don't feel like working on it. And if I confront that, then I realize, okay, let me work on this, get this over with, and as reward, I can later on do that. Another thing we can do is to practice what's called forethought. Now, forethought means imagining our future selves at the end of the day. So before I go on social media, and if I know I'm someone that's going to spend 20, 30 minutes on social media, I have a deadline to work on, I imagine what my future self is going to be. And I think the right time frame is in the evening, like 7 p.m. or 10 p.m. How do I want to feel? How do I want to imagine myself? I want to imagine myself feeling fulfilled and rewarded and relaxed and feeling so happy that I finished that deadline. And the more concrete your visualization is, the easier it is for you to act on it. And so that visualization is a good way to help keep yourself on track. And of course, there's so many other things we can do to improve our self-regulation. There's hacks, turning off notifications, reducing your social network so you're not having to keep track of 2,000, 10,000 people, but just focusing on those individuals, those few individuals who are meaningful for us. And we know from Robin Dunbar, who's a sociologist, that people really can only have a few meaningful relationships. So there's about 150 people that we can really maintain a meaningful relationship with, and only 5 of those are very close relationships. So just focus on a smaller network of people to nurture.
Yeah. Is there something to be said? And I think you did allude to this in your book, like the power of weak ties, for example, where you might have 150 people with whom you can be, quote unquote, friends with, 5 close friends, but some of that sort of bridging capital could be some person who you connected with on LinkedIn, say 7 years ago, because you met at a conference. But then if I want that person to introduce me to someone else and I'll reach out to them on LinkedIn, they might actually do that. So there is some value, but the amount of energy and effort that I need to invest in maintaining that relationship is probably nothing beyond the initial connecting on LinkedIn 7 years ago.
Yeah, there is this phenomenon called the power of weak ties, or it's called the strength of weak ties. And this was identified by a sociologist, Granovetter, and research shows that we're very likely to get things like job offers or some kind of recommendation, not necessarily through a direct tie, but through someone who that direct tie can introduce us to. So of these 150 people with who you have a meaningful relationship with, one of those might be able to introduce you to someone with who you get a nice job offer.
Okay, great. And something on a agency there, and it's something I've been incorporating into my work for the last few years now, or into my day, is that meta awareness that you refer to in the book, which I guess is a form of mindfulness. Like if I am going for a walk, 30-minute walk as a break, like I'm intentional about, in my case, and for some people this may not work, but for me, I don't want to look at my phone during that time. That's just, just letting my thoughts process and simmer rather than, inputting more data by looking at my phone. And I found that the more I do that, after 10 days, 20 days, 30 days, that urge to reach for my phone on a walk, it's kind of suppressed. Similarly, if I'm catching the train or I'm on the subway, that for me is, I just want to either read a book or look out the window or just think about life and contemplate. And I found that the more I've done that, like that urge now is completely gone. So I guess it's something that people can kind of train like a muscle to not do the thing that's ailing them, be it looking at their phone, be it switching screens or whatever it is, the more, they get used to a particular mode of operating.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's wonderful that you're able to, that you could wean yourself away from it. And the thing to keep in mind is instead of feeling the absence of something, instead of feeling the absence of your phone, instead think about what you're getting in return, the presence of this world around you, if it's nature or passing by people, all the other things that you're able to be aware of. So, think of all the things that you're getting, right? The positive things that you're getting by not being restricted by looking at a phone.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about all that's wrong with the nature of work today, people's attention being absolutely diminished, switching screens every 47 seconds, looking at their phones all day. We have kind of skirted around some things people can do to improve their relationship with technology, but what can, say, organizations, teams, and knowledge workers, do today? What kind of proactive steps can they actually take to reclaim their attention and get the most out of themselves during the workday?
Yeah, so it's important to consider that no individual can really do this on their own. I know there's a lot of suggestions for doing digital detoxes, but we live in a technological world. And for any individual to pull out, especially if you're a knowledge worker of any kind, you only end up penalizing yourself. You get cut off from important communications. So we have to think about solutions on a collective level so that no individual is penalized. So, for example, organizations can establish a quiet time. So a period of time during the workday when no electronic communications will be sent. That includes Slack, not just email, also includes phone calls. This can help rewire people's expectations that electronic communications will not arrive. And so people don't have to check email 77 times a day, right? So it can help reset our expectations. And I think that's really important. Organizations can also think about scheduling meetings so that they don't happen during peak focus times, so that those times can be devoted to allowing people to do their hard and creative work. And, more broadly, some countries have even instituted right to disconnect laws. And these are laws that don't penalize workers who do not answer electronic communications after work hours. So this gives people a chance to psychologically detach from work. And one of the reasons why people are so stressed, why we drain our resources, is because people are just not able to psychologically detach. One of the best ways to replenish and restore your attentional resources is to give yourself time to do that, psychologically detach. And then we also know that people can psychologically reattach better to work the next day and be more present.
Absolutely. And I think on setting up time for meetings, Cal Newport, who wrote Deep Work, amongst other books, talks about office hours, whereby you might have a 2-hour block every afternoon, or maybe it's 2 or 3 times a week, where people can schedule 20-minute meetings in your calendar to ask questions, do whatever they need to do, rather than just being able to steal your time. Because I know so many people in the corporate world in particular who go to the office, they think they've got a relatively empty day, and then they check their calendar and it's just been booked out with 1-hour meetings back to back. And all this work that they needed to get done just keeps piling and piling. And when I looked at the nature of workplace stress for my last book, one of the big contributing factors was just excessive workload and a lack of control. And redesigning how teams work, how individuals work, that workflow at large organizations, and leaders, they need to take ownership of this, can give people more control over their work and help them get on top of those workloads, which will hopefully improve, their subjective well-being.
That's right. The scope of work has expanded over the years. And, as people are involved in more different kinds of projects, the amount of electronic communications, the amount of information they have to deal with also escalates. So it's, we're in this kind of cycle where work is expanding, communication is expanding, number of people in our circles are expanding, people with who we have meetings. So yeah, we do have to think about in terms of organizational structures that there needs to be change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're almost out of time, Gloria, so we might wrap it up there. But if people want to learn more, we've literally just skimmed the surface of what's in your new book, Attention Span, Finding Focus for a Fulfilling Life. They can find that on Amazon and everywhere good books are sold. If our audience wants to connect with you, Gloria, where's the best place to do that?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to hear from folks. You can find me at www.gloriamark.com. It's all one word, gloriamark.com. I would love to hear from you. You can learn more about the book. And hopefully we'd have a nice conversation.
Awesome. Well, we'll add that to the show notes for our listeners. Thank you so much for your time, Gloria, and all the best with the rest of the book launch.
Thank you.